afternoon. Thank you for joining Channel 7 News. I'm Jenna.
And I'm Wyatt.
Today's story takes us to Capitol Hill, where we will be hearing Bill H.R. 3420, National Forest Protection and Restoration Act. Wyatt is going to tell us a little bit of background information on this bill.
Thank you, Jenna. So, as you heard, this bill is the H.R. 3420, National Forest Protection and Restoration Act. What that means is, basically, the bill is to try to eliminate commercial logging on federal public lands. The goals stated in the bill are to save taxpayers money, to reduce deficit, to cut corporate welfare, protect communities from wildfires, encourage federal land management agency reform and accountability, protect and restore American natural heritage. And those are some of the few things that you might hear mentioned today. A couple of words that might come up a lot are commercial logging and federal lands. I just want to give you a brief rundown of what those mean. So commercial logging is the sale of timber. It's also the execution of a sale of timber or any other transfer of timber or biomass to an individual, company, or other entity. So you might hear that a couple times today. And federal lands is what is being debated today, which lands can be protected. And a federal land is in the National Forest System, National Wildlife Refugee System, land under jurisdiction of Bureau of Land Management. So those are the lands that are in question today and will be discussed a lot. This bill focuses a lot on recreation, and it may potentially change the future of timber harvesting in America. It's kind of a modern day Gifford Pinchot versus John Muir, if you will. So, back to you.
Today we will hear speakers from the House, including states such as Virginia, Florida, Oregon, Arizona, California, Maine, and West Virginia. Groups that support and oppose the bill, an economist, an ecologist, and representatives from the U.S. National Park Service, the U.S. Fisheries and Wildlife Service, and the U.S. Department of Agriculture, Forest Service. Now the House Speaker is going to conduct the hearing.
I'm also a representative from West Virginia. I'd like to introduce the House members now. So you've got Mr. Wesley Johnson from Virginia. Now I'd like to call a support group up here. Let's see. This is Caroline Sapita. Please come on up.
My name is Caroline Sapita, and I'm here to support the H.R. Bill 3420, the National Forest Protection and Restoration Act. As you briefly heard mentioned by the media, this is an act that is going to try to end commercial logging in national lands. And right now, less than 5% of commercial logging occurs in these national lands. And so when you think about that, that's not really a very large portion that would be affected when you're looking at the timber industry. And the redirecting of these funds is something that's going to be really important. One of the goals to try to redirect these funds out west is going to be at fire risk areas. So putting more money and resources into prescribed burns and educating people about wildfires and educating basically the public about why protecting these forests are such a good idea. Another thing that's going to be very important is replanting of native vegetation. This is really important because kind of going along with the prescribed burns, different invasive species have different effects on forest ecosystems and can affect the way that they naturally regenerate themselves. So replanting of native vegetation is going to be very important in these areas. They want to protect the forest heritage of the area instead of protecting the timber industry. So this is something that's really going to take into account the natural use of the land and the history of this land versus just trying to preserve it to be a forest production site. So really just looking at the integrity of the land. And something that I think is really important is taking this land that was put into a national trust, put into the National Park Service, national lands made for the people to enjoy at their leisure for free, and taking it out of the hands of the timber industry and putting it more into the hands back into the people so that people have full use and full rights to all this land that they traditionally should have had. Kind of on the more money side, it's going to help save taxpayer money, and this can be estimated to be about $1 billion in taxpayer money from the previous year. And so that's a lot of really good money that the taxpayers aren't really seeing any returns on right now. As well as going back to restoring the ecosystem integrity, there's also alternatives that can be used for the fiber that's not going to be harvested from these areas anymore. So some people might say that this might hurt the industry in looking at natural fibers that can be used. However, there's a lot of agriculture waste that's burned now because it can't be used in the timber industry as a fiber substitute.
20 seconds.
So I think that's something that is a different way where we can look at different alternatives that already exist as opposed to just using trees, so.
3 minutes, go ahead.
Hi, my name is Amber Koyman. I'm here as a representative of the Nature Conservancy to express our support of the National Forest Protection and Restoration Act and the ban of commercial logging activities on our public lands. The Nature Conservancy's mission is to conserve the lands and waters on which all life depends. Here's a quick general overview of our program. Over the last 26 years, our conservation projects have protected more than 119 million acres of land worldwide and over 15 million acres of land in the United States alone. We acquire private land through land trusts, conservation easements, and private reserves, and also establish local groups to encourage the protection of ecologically sensitive land. Working on private land is very effective. However, protecting our public land with conservation programs similar to our own will help us achieve our global mission in reaching tangible and lasting results. The Conservancy works with government officials and partners to support public policies such as this one that protect our lands and waters so that the next generations of Americans can enjoy the biodiversity and natural ecosystems benefits. As threats to critical lands such as our pristine forests intensify, these activities further stress already fragmented lands, disrupt habitat for native wildlife, and pollute the environment. Because the programs under this bill are similar to our own in many ways, if this bill is enacted, it will be a comprehensive addition to the goals and hard work that the Nature Conservancy has already begun. At the Nature Conservancy, protecting nature isn't about putting up fences around pristine areas to keep people out. We are about protecting the places and resources we depend on for the benefit of the animals, plants, and people. The National Forest Protection and Restoration Act complies with this statement by allowing for recreation and tourism in the National Forest System and integrating agency programs and projects to restore native biodiversity and ecological processes. A few other statements in this bill that stand out to us are under Section 7, Natural Heritage Restoration. The precautionary approach will be used where before taking any action, benefits will be measured and will outweigh the risks. Ecological research will be conducted to make responsible decisions, and programs will be monitored to ensure the effectiveness and the long-term success of the plans. If a project fails, it will be evaluated and solutions will be provided to correct the project. A committee of scientists will be appointed to provide scientific and technical support. Each of these statements show careful consideration for the environment and commitment to the proper conservation of the natural areas of our public land. Our passion for conservation is why we agree that commercial logging of federal lands should be eliminated. The opportunity to protect our nation's natural heritage and restore native biodiversity in our public forests is not one to dismiss. And with that being said, we support this bill. Thank you.
Okay, hello, my name is Lucas Kearns, and I'm here representing Defenders of Wildlife. Defenders of Wildlife is a national nonprofit organization whose goal is to protect all native plants and animals in their native communities and full range of North American biodiversity. Although our emphasis is on imperiled species, we are one of the few organizations that still focus on biodiversity conservation. One of the challenges the Defenders of Wildlife face is commercial logging, and I'm here to address the National Forest Protection and Restoration Act, which deals with commercial logging on federal lands. Biodiversity is threatened by commercial logging because logging can cause long-term habitat changes and disrupt ecosystem services. The goals of the conservation plan of Defenders of Wildlife will be satisfied by the National Forest Protection and Restoration Act. This act is aimed at restoring natural heritage by restoring native biodiversity and ecological processes, which is also Defenders of Wildlife's mission. Restoring natural heritage would be accomplished by a ban on commercial logging and a plan to mitigate the damages to habitat on lands disturbed by logging. Defenders of Wildlife's plan for conservation is fundamentally based on prevention, protection, and restoration. The ban on logging itself will both prevent habitat destruction and protect wildlife from future logging, and the combination of preventative and protective measures is critical for conserving biodiversity in the future. The National Forest Protection and Restoration Act's plan to restore native heritage would also provide a means for land restoration. The bill states that in most cases restoration of damaged areas will be left and restoration will occur naturally, but in many cases immediate action will be taken to help mitigate habitat damages caused by commercial logging. To address long-term habitat changes, the bill requires the reintroduction of native species in areas where upon evaluation it is found that species that once contributed to natural ecological processes are not present. Along with the views of Defenders of Wildlife, it is stated in the bill that it is in the interests of the American people and the international community to protect and restore native biodiversity in our federal public lands for its inherent benefits, the resulting economic benefits, and for protection of this natural heritage for current and future generations. It is Defenders of Wildlife's goal to work to a point where species are secure, are no longer threatened, and have well-distributed populations. The Forest Restoration and Protection Act would accomplish Defender of Wildlife's goals of biodiversity and habitat conservation by combining prevention, protection, and restoration efforts. Thank you.
Good afternoon, my name is Chris Harris. I'm here to oppose the HR 3420 Natural Forest Protection and Restoration Act. What this act is trying to do is put a ban on commercial logging on the national forest and public lands in this country. Right now, it was stated earlier that less than 5% of commercial logging happens on these lands, but that 5% still makes up a significant portion of the logging industry. If you try and shut down the commercial logging from this, you're going to have a flood of market back into the commercial private sector, which is going to increase competition, but it can also cause a decrease in prices that are happening with the timber sales because you have less land and more people trying to get into that area as well. One of the big things that is being pushed in this bill is the concern of wildfire and the effects that logging has on that. Currently, there are many operations that combine both logging and fire, prescribed burns in order to mitigate fire risk in these areas. Cutting out logging completely takes out an aspect of potential management of this wildfire, management of this land by removing it from the national forest and public lands. The logging also helps to remove and mitigate effects from invasive species and also insects and diseases. On the national forest, a lot of logging that is carried out in an effect to help slow the spread of certain diseases such as gypsy moth or when you have large amounts of dieback. The commercial logging aspect is used. It also brings in revenues for the national forest that they're able to operate and create funding for their programs. The funding, this program being taken out, could potentially create a loss of not only jobs, but it also could create a loss of revenue inflow for the national forest and public lands. These are just some of the factors that could be affected if you remove commercial logging, and some of the factors why I oppose removing commercial logging from the public lands and national forests. Thank you.
Brittany Mays, and I'm here to represent the Virginia Loggers Association, and we oppose proposed bill HR 3420, the National Forest Protection and Restoration Act, because it will eliminate important jobs in the forest industry. There's 193 million acres of U.S. timberland involved in the U.S. Forest Service regulations, and by eliminating logging and management efforts on these lands, it will increase the amount of dead and down debris, which will in turn increase the effects of wildfires on these lands. As standing timber dies and falls due to natural effects, if you log it, you will remove this timber before it falls and dies. And by increasing the logging activity on public lands, it will generate revenue for the government, which in turn can be used to decrease the deficit. Why waste a valuable timber resource on these lands by allowing them to die and rot rather than sell them and generate revenue? We're not trying to eliminate timber on these lands, but just speed up the natural rotation time of the timber by harvesting the timber while it's still valuable and then regenerating the land, allowing for new timber to grow. By eliminating logging on these lands, jobs in the forestry sector will be eliminated, and this will not help the economy, but rather hurt it. We should be trying to create more jobs, not eliminate them. Therefore, we should be increasing commercial logging on federal land, not eliminating it.
Fraser, with the VFA, the Virginia Forestry Association. I'll be opposing the bill, HR 3420. We would be against this bill, which prohibits the commercial logging on national forest lands because of the jobs it will take away from our members. The VFA is a private group of foresters from within the state of Virginia, active foresters. They're in the industry now. If this bill is passed, it'll take away jobs from the foresters within our organization. The bill is concerned with the fire from commercial logging, and the VFA is part of a push for increased biomass harvesting, which eliminates the debris and fire buildup from clean chipping, and we support all biomass. So I think the VFA would oppose the HR 3420.
Thank you, Dylan. My name is Sam Hayes, and I'm a local economist as well as a professor here at Virginia Tech University, and I was asked to come and give my insight on this bill. In 1995, 2 reports were conducted regarding commercial logging on federal public lands. The first, a Forest Service draft report, shows that recreation and tourism generates 30 times more jobs and 30 times more income than commercial logging does. The second, a Comptroller General report, along with his 1998 follow-up report, shows that hundreds of millions of dollars are spent annually on Forest Service timber sales, of which only a small fraction is returned to the federal treasury. This results in a massive net loss, mainly from taxpayer money. The logging that is currently being done also accounts for less than 5% of the timber consumption in the U.S., resulting in a very small dip in timber availability should these operations be shut down. If these operations were terminated, however, the existing contracts would be paid for with money from existing reimbursement funds, federal government loans, or funds directly from the Forest Service and Bureau of Land Management accounts. The Secretary of Agriculture, in consultation with the Secretary of the Interior, is charged with calculating the annual appropriated funds for the 5 fiscal years prior to this act being passed. Their support will include funds used for things like timber sales, vegetation management, inventory, monitoring and research, road maintenance, and law enforcement, among others. These values will be used to determine how much money may be authorized for use in carrying out this act, and that no more than 2/3 of the amount calculated may be used annually. Finally, the Secretaries of Agriculture and the Interior are each responsible for creating a National Heritage Restoration Corps to restore native biodiversity. This would not only create new jobs, but the salaries could be paid for using the hundreds of millions saved by not having commercial logging, as well as leaving a large amount of money left over. Thank you.
Hello everyone, my name is Samantha Ratcliffe, and I'm a local ecologist, and thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today. So, the commercial logging of the federal public lands recognized in this bill has had numerous negative impacts on these lands and the natural heritage of our country as a whole. In a more broad perspective, logging has had a substantial impact on the ongoing conflict of global warming. With the removal of trees, one of the greatest carbon dioxide stores has also been removed, leaving carbon dioxide that could have been stored in those trees to take up residence in our atmosphere. Then with the added carbon dioxide emissions from transportation of the trees and their industrial uses, there was more carbon dioxide negatively affecting our atmosphere that would not have been necessary in the first place had we not cut down the trees for our commercial profit. As a result, global warming has prompted more. In return, numerous global ecological systems are negatively affected by the results of rising temperatures and rising sea levels. But that is just a more global and long-term outlook on logging. There is an immediate and more localized perspective on the commercial logging of our nation's federal and public lands that must also be addressed. Deforestation from commercial logging can have various effects on the ecological systems of our federal public lands. Forests absorb rainfall, hinder stream runoff, reduce floods, increase slope stability, retain topsoil, and hinder erosion and siltation in streams. With the removal of this natural system, freshwater ecosystems will exhibit the negative effect of erosion and siltation, which will harm the biodiversity of existing organisms in these ecological systems. Organisms unable to assimilate to these human-influenced changes will be diminished. In another study, the Forest Service has confirmed the finding that logging including both thinning and clear cutting, increases fire severity. By removing the trees, the cooling shade that they provide to the understory is eliminated, leaving flammable debris. Though some forest fires can be very beneficial to wildlife habitats, severe fires can be dangerous in ecosystems not adapted to fires. The results could be devastating. Another impact that commercial logging has had on the ecological crisis resulting from the severe habitat loss and fragmentation of American forests. The vast majority of America's original pristine forests have been logged, and what little primary forest that remains exists almost entirely on the public lands. So restoring and protecting the public lands of native wildlife of our nation's national forests will result in the protection of the biodiversity of national wildlife and fisheries in those habitats. The nation's natural heritage must be protected, and it is
and its damaged forest must be given an opportunity to recover in order for the biodiversity to be sustained. Deep ecologist Aldo Leopold said, "A thing is right when it tends to preserve the integrity, stability, and beauty of the biotic community. If the objectives of this bill are met, the local ecosystems of the federal public lands will benefit greatly, and it could even benefit the global environment as a whole."
And for now, I would say that it is not the time to enact this bill. The National Forest Protection and Restoration Act is an attempt to change the way that the Forest Service and other individuals or agencies operate by stressing the necessity of stopping the cutting and sales of timber from federal lands. For many years, the U.S. Forest Service has used timber resources for gaining additional money for their operations, and this offsets the budget losses of the Forest Service. That money is not intended to go back into the National Treasury. The goals of the Forest Service are changing. In the past, as I said before, the Forest Service dealt with logging and utilizing the resource. They are now changing into more of a multiple use platform, which includes having more recreation on federal lands. And the American people are beginning to view the resource as more of a way to recreate and not as a form of consumption. And time needs to be allowed for the Forest Service to change with the views of the American people. It is a difficult task, and if the bill is passed, it could be almost impossible to change back to a consumptive or timber sale form. The 2 years that would be allowed for the completion of sales before they would have to be stopped would allow some time to get these sales completed, but that may not be enough. As more ways come into play to gain money from recreation activities, the guidelines set forth in this bill will be easier to follow, but for now some sales still need to remain in effect. It is true that fires start from smaller fuels, but some of these fuels provide vital habitat to some smaller animals, which, if you're pushing biodiversity, is huge. And also from cutting down trees, you provide early successional species such as pines, which offers more habitat for some of the early successional species. One thing the bill keeps mentioning is about keeping the forest pristine, which has a very different meaning for very different people. We're talking about making it the way before Christopher Columbus came, when the Indians were burning the grass, or are we talking about making every single tree there?
I'm Cody Madison. I represent the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service within the Department of the Interior. My agency's purpose is working with others to conserve, protect, and enhance fish, wildlife, and plants and their habitats for the continued benefits of the American people. For this reason, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service feels strongly that the National Forest Protection and Restoration Act will greatly aid in us doing our job more efficiently. A quote from the bill is, "Forests absorb rainfall, retard stream runoff, reduce floods, increase slope stability, retain topsoil, and retard soil erosion, and siltation in streams, irrigation ditches, and reservoirs. This will not only restore ecological value to the sites that will be protected, but it will also provide a new safe and disturbance-free area for fish and wildlife to thrive and produce healthy populations." This bill will ensure the preservation of many acres of forest land that either be saved from harvesting and losing its ecological value, or saved from further damage of currently misused practices. These additional acres of protected forest land will then be available for fish and wildlife that can be left to regenerate naturally, or by using our land management techniques that my agency has currently been using to create or maintain ecological value. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Agency is confident in the ecological value of any site, whether it was naturally remediated or manipulated by humans, for restoration and ecological value. The methodology of this bill will help my agency do its job because of the fact that independently owned land is historically not kept in a very pristine state. This also applies to forest land that is owned by the government and logged by companies. especially when the land is managed to produce the highest dollar value that can be produced off this said parcel. The bill will allow for a great opportunity to keep land pristine, provide more habitats for the public to enjoy our nation's fish and wildlife. It is a very difficult and expensive task to provide healthy fish and wildlife populations for the public when their habitats are continuously being taken advantage of, which has been happening at an increased rate, especially to land under private control or management. If more and more land is continuously logged and disturbed, the amount of habitat suitable for all kinds of fish and wildlife will dwindle and cause large health issues in populations. There has been recent scientific work in streams that has determined that larger and healthier fish populations exist in streams with large weed debris in it. And it's been a standard practice in the past to remove the debris out of the streams, and part of this bill would be placing the large weed debris back into the streams, which will greatly help in restoring fish populations for the public to enjoy. It is the opinion of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Agency that in order for us to do our job efficiently, both now and in the future, legislation like this will be necessary. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is also very able and willing, as the bill states, to help with implementation of
Representing the National Park Service. To begin, the National Park Service's goal is to preserve unimpaired the natural and cultural resources and values of the National Park System for the enjoyment, education, and inspiration of this and future generations. The Park Service cooperates with partners to extend the benefits of natural and cultural resource conservation and outdoor recreation throughout this country and the world. Over the years, to make sure this goal is reached, problems have been seen. Leaving forests unimpaired has resulted in many large wildland fires. These occur as a result of lightning and other natural processes, as well as careless and forgetful acts by individuals who have included recreational users. Historically, we have seen the result of wildland fires have. The Yellowstone Fire of 1988 cost over $120 million to control and burn over 1.2 million acres of national park land. Yellowstone consists of 2,222,000 acres, which means about half the park was burned as a result of this fire. This shows that wildfires happen regardless of whether the land is unimpaired. When providing recreational opportunities for individuals, fires have been a common trend historically, and there is always the chance of them occurring when human use is involved. A large part of preserving these lands is providing the public recreational opportunities. With these opportunities comes making sure that individuals can access the areas in question. This means adequate roads and trails to get into and out of forested areas. We have seen that there is a positive user response when trails are well maintained and provide individuals with opportunities to see these natural landscapes. Leaving trails unmaintained or not having them results in users going into the ecosystem and having a negative ecological effect by trampling and impairing the natural habitat of organisms. Providing new jobs is always a goal of the National Park Service, but with these new jobs comes new funds to provide payment. As stated earlier, the main goal we are trying to achieve is preserving forests unimpaired and preventing the forest from being cut down as involved in this process. Public lands were originally set aside to manage timber as a resource and prevent overharvesting. As a timber resource, harvesting is involved at times. The timber industry is a necessary part of the U.S. economy. It also provides jobs to individuals and results in lumber to build our homes and businesses. Preserving our natural biodiversity is very important and another goal of the Park Service. Preserving this biodiversity of public lands that may border or share a common region with the national parks would help both ecosystems because organisms do move in and out of many areas. Work being done to enhance the land can also have a negative effect on the movement and due to the movement and activities of workers. This includes vehicle use and changing the ecosystem. Changing current management strategies has also been used by the Park Service in the past to improve the ecosystem. Thank you.
The National Park Service, Fish and Wildlife Service, and the Forest Service. Thanks also to our scientists and interest groups, particularly those from my own state, Virginia, for their testimonies and expert reports regarding this bill, the National Forest Protection and Restoration Act. I believe this bill displays the continued relevance of the national debate over federal lands and their appropriate usage. As a part of the governing body of this great nation, we have the responsibility to make sure that we pass legislation that considers appropriate consumption of the natural resources and values of the people of our nation for their land. I'm Representative Wesley Johnson, and this bill is of particular importance to the members of my state, the Commonwealth of Virginia. Federal land constitutes 2.3 million acres, or 9.2% of the land in Virginia. While currently, the majority of forest practices and timber harvesting within the state occur on private land, this bill threatens future harvesting on this large portion of government-owned land, which represents considerable value in terms of timberland. The boundaries of the national forest within Virginia fall within areas of the state where forest products represent a considerable amount of the economy, so this bill stands to affect the industry directly. In its current form, I cannot support this bill. I'm not convinced it is based on solid ecology, and it stands to hurt the availability of the forest for large forest products industry, both within the state, my state, and within the country, which is bad economically both for Virginia and even more so for states with higher percentages of federal land. Several questions must be considered to clarify this bill and determine whether or not to pass it. What does this bill constitute as pristine forest or damaged forest? We have to define these terms to even fully consider this bill. Where are we obtaining the funding for this bill? Should we really make decisions to remove timber cutting in about 50% of the land area within the 11 coterminous western states? A large portion of their economic well-being is at stake here, compared to my own personal reservations about negative effects within my state. The decision will affect almost 25% of land within our country owned by federal agencies. Should we really treat this land all with the same homogeneous solution found in this bill? What about the growing biomass industry? It stands maybe to address this potential of removing fuel for fires. What are other options for dealing with this fire problem? This bill also questions the effectiveness of our federal best management practices. This is not a separate issue. In conclusion, Mr. Speaker, this bill does not represent the best interests of Virginia or of America, and we should not pass it.
Of the 30 million acres of forest in Oregon, only 10 million acres are private forest. So about 60% of Oregon's forest is federal land. However, only 15% of timber harvested in Oregon is from that federal land. Private landowners are harvesting their timber much more intensively and often than the federal government in Oregon, yet they somehow manage to keep the trees growing and enjoy the benefits of having forests. The forest industry in Oregon employs about 76,000 people, which is 5% of our entire workforce, and it's responsible for $12.6 million of direct revenue within our state. Oregon has been the top lumber producing state for decades and produces almost a quarter of all plywood produced in the United States. Ceasing logging activities on federal lands in Oregon will affect our forest industry, and decreasing supply will lead to increased timber prices. That will encourage landowners to harvest their timber more than they already do, which I'm sure is not the intent of this bill. Product prices will increase and people will have difficulty affording them. Demand will drop, and mills won't be able to sell their product. Many mills will go out of business and jobs will be lost. Powerhouse, that is Oregon's forest products industry, will be nothing. Domestic production forest products will drop significantly throughout the United States. Exports will cease, and for the first time ever, Americans might have to look to foreign powers for lumber and paper, another thing on our long list of dependencies to outside countries. Oregon's forests are divided into 3 categories: wood production, multiple resources, and reserved forest area. Each of these makes up about a third of our forests. This means that private owners are setting aside their own reserved areas, and the federal government has reserved wilderness areas on which harvesting does not happen already. In other areas, however, timber harvesting is an important part of our management plans, and banning that practice would likely result in degradation that we had not counted on into a state of forests that does not meet the needs of our people. Perhaps in other parts of the country, harvesting of public forests is a practice that causes more harm than good, but in my great state, it is the cornerstone of our greatest natural industry. Thank you.
My name is Kyle Dose, and I represent the state of Arizona. After reviewing this bill and compiling research, in addition to listening from our guest speakers today, I've concluded that I support the bill and that it is taking major steps to move in the right directions for many reasons. Fire has been a major problem in the last few decades, especially in western states, including my home state of Arizona. In 2002, Arizona had the largest timber fire in a century. Colorado, Oregon, New Mexico, California, and Alaska have all set records for acres burned in the past 15 years. This bill would help to address the huge problem of forest fires and further protect the citizens of Arizona and other states. From an economic standpoint, it also makes complete sense. We're currently subsidizing commercial logging in national forests and have been for quite some time. Not only is this practice unsustainable in an ecological sense, but also economically. Estimates gauge that taxpayers have lost upwards of $6.5 billion from 1997 to 2004 on these logging subsidies. In addition, logging jobs are the second most dangerous job in the United States, with average wages of roughly $13 an hour. Recreation and tourism create 30 times more jobs and 30 times the revenue. The bill provides an in-depth section on the mechanics of retraining those who would potentially lose their jobs, which would allow for a relatively seamless transition from logging to other jobs such as parks and tourism. The money currently being spent on subsidies could and should be reinvested into science, research, alternatives, and revitalizing our public lands. Commercial logging has not only impacted the quantity of our forests, but also the quality. 440,000 miles of logging roads have damaged our public lands and public forests. Fragmentation, habitat destruction, erosion, and sedimentation of waterways are just a few of the negative externalities often overlooked from commercial logging. These forests, which we're losing rapidly, have also helped to sequester carbon and mitigate climate change. It's time to start thinking sustainably and start thinking that these lands are what we pass on to our children. Overall, this bill would reshape the way Americans use and view their public lands. The people of Arizona would be much better off in terms of taxes, fire prevention, and stewardship, which is why I choose to support the bill and give my vote in favor of the National Forest Protection and Restoration Act. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Cody Hanna. As mentioned before, I'm a representative for California. We all know what the benefits are of trees and biodiversity, so I'm not going to mention it. This bill wasn't created to hurt the timber industry or the employees of the timber industry in any way. Its purpose is to help mend the predicaments that we have gotten ourselves into and are now threatening our way of life, endangering future generations' capability to partake in what our generation and our past generations before us and have fortunate enough to enjoy the ability to live and survive. I'm sorry. Though the timber industry is a strong business for California, the costs to profit off the use of the trees in the national forests and federal lands outweigh the benefits, not just by monetary value, but also aesthetic values. California has 101 million acres, making it the third largest country, but it also has a population of 35 million. And it is increasing every year, which makes it the most populated state in the U.S., with California embracing almost 13% of the country's population. The influence from such a drastic population that the quality of air, water, and soil is becoming more apparent that if we do not do something soon, the probability of our state to be inhabitable by man or animal and even plants will decline promptly. 5.1 million acres are designated national wilderness areas, including 18 national forests, with 48 million acres being under the jurisdiction and labeled federal public lands. These lands contribute to almost half of the state, meaning this protection and management of these vast amounts of land is crucial for the safety of California occupants. The increase in temperature, climate change, along with the decreasing rainfall in certain areas of the country has contributed to the intense and the amount of wildfires our country suffers from every year, and has doubled the destruction of acres in the last 40 years. While California has taken the substantial hit of the fires, the actions that will be enacted with this bill will only help decrease the frequency of these fires, the damage dealt, and they increase the ability to control them. Crap. There are over 800 native species of wildlife and 6,500 different species of plants that grow nowhere else in the world besides our state that needs to be protected. With this bill, we hope that reclamation efforts for the affected areas will flourish back into or at least become close to the original native ecosystems. It is essential for us as humankind to protect, replenish, and manage our federal lands and forests by sustainable and environmentally friendly means. And by achieving these goals set out by the bill, we can only improve the vitality of life of the citizens of California, the United States, the world, and the health of the planet.
And the previous representatives that have gone before me, as well as the people who have come to talk about the merits or not merits of the previous mentioned bill. As stated before, I'm from the great state of Maine. If you forgive my duress, I'd like to talk to you today about this bill. 90% of my state of Maine is covered in forests, which makes it the most forested state in the United States, and that is in acres, 17.7 million acres. Now, only 5.6% of that is owned by the public land. So if you break that up between state and federal land, you've got about 800,000 acres worth of state-owned land and only 200,000 acres of federal land in Maine, which means in the grand scheme of things, that's not very much land in our state. Maine's logging industry is one of our most sustainable and powerful industries, considering, you look at the top, the northern half of Maine, it's almost all forest. Anybody else living up there is, well, they love the forest. Recently, our current governor, Governor LePage, actually has suggested a 60% plus increase in logging on state lands, and I can't support that, and because of that, I would like to go against logging on the other 200,000 acres of federal land, so I would be against this. So, let's make sure I've covered everything I wanted to. And again, we also went over biodiversity. We've gone over a couple of times. It applies for Maine as well. We have some older forests that are great environments for certain species that can only really flourish in those environments, and we like to keep it that way. But as you can tell, with mostly private land, some of it's logged, some of it's not, we seem to be doing a pretty decent job, and therefore I'm still against this bill. Thank you very much.
Thank you to everybody that's going before me. Dylan Marlowe, I'm a Speaker of the House and also a representative from West Virginia. I'd like to give a little bit of my case on this. I'm not denying what was said earlier about forests help eliminate soil erosion, absorb rainfall, and create natural topsoil. But trees do grow back. The forests don't turn into concrete once everything's harvested. Slash left from logging help minimize what I just mentioned, soil erosion and stuff like that. Also, an economic aspect, some loggers work solely or mainly for the Forest Service on these lands. Depend on the finances generated from their work to stay in business. And without that, it's not good for the economy as a whole. This can cause an increase in forest product prices. Mills can't stay open. It's just a domino effect that will devastate the economy. The bill mentioned something about natural biodiversity. No genetically modified organisms, which is fine. Natural regeneration works just as well. Like I said, trees do grow back. And as far as the erosion goes, again, loggers use the necessary BMPs to reduce erosion and support water quality. So I'm going to have to vote no on this. Looks like the bill was shot down, so for the matter of this exercise, it will be sent through the Senate. Thank you.
Thanks, stuff we saw today. I'm sure everyone was on the edge of the seat the whole time. We heard some great arguments from opposing groups and supporting groups. We heard the government reps from different organizations speak and give us great statistics and facts on what was going on in the forest. And the House members did a great job representing their states and speaking for their people. We even had one House member not show up, so maybe that could be like a scandal moving forward. Who knows? Something bad. Anyway, so now what's going to happen next since the bill is killed? As was mentioned, it's going to be introduced to the Senate as a fresh bill. That will be taking place on Wednesday, and we'll give you full coverage on that when that happens. As for now, we're going to kick it out to Jenna in the field, who I believe has some questions to ask people.
And I know that you were in support of this bill. So what do you think this will mean for Arizona?
Well, in terms of forest fires, I just think it's really sad that we're not taking measures like this to really do all that we can to stop the forest fires. Arizona has been hit pretty hard, along with Colorado and California in the past couple of years. But the biggest thing for me was economics. I don't know how we can keep funneling money into this and losing billions of dollars into this industry.
Thank you very much. So I was just wondering if you or the Nature Conservancy had thought of any type of a next move, because with the bill not being passed along, then this means that you're kind of like back to step zero and you have like nothing to go off of. So.
Well, the Nature Conservancy itself is always working to gain more private land So the programs that we already have for that private land will obviously still be a huge help to all of the entire global change that we're trying to make. Maybe we'll see what happens in the Senate. So.
Thank you, Ms. Quinn. So the 4-2 vote. And how do you feel that the bill went in your favor? Because I know you said that the timber industry is very big in Virginia and helped a lot with your economy and with jobs and all. So just wondering how you felt about that.
I'm very happy. I think Virginia is happy as a state. It's a big victory just for the industry within our state and other states that have a lot of forest industry. So I hope it continues to go the same way in the Senate as it did in the House.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson. Lastly, I'd like to go to Professor Sam Hayes. I was wondering what will the opposing of this bill mean for our economy?
Thank you, Jenna. That's a very interesting question. This bill has kind of come at a very exciting time in our nation's history in that we are making a big push towards sustainability, especially towards many of our natural resources. Having this bill not being passed could have a big blow to our economic power, both from recreation, but also it is kind of interesting that it will keep many of the loggers still in business. Yes, they could have logged on private lands, but many of these public lands do have a lot of biodiversity and like tree availability that they're not able to get anywhere else. So it's going to be interesting seeing how it passes in the Senate and where we're going to go from there.
Thank you very much, Professor Hayes, and thank you to everyone else that answered my questions. Back to you, Wyatt.
So again, join us on Wednesday for more coverage of this as it goes back to the Senate as a fresh bill. We're going to hear all new voices, all new opinions, all new stats, so I'm very excited to hear that. And thanks for everyone for tuning into our show. This is Wyatt signing off for Jenna on Channel 7 News, and see you Wednesday.